This is the 9th episode of Uncommon Decency, and it's been a wild ride. We had listeners from 42 countries tune in, and we have so much positive feedback from everyone, and wanted to thank you for tuning in such large numbers. And it made us think that we would love to give you a voice in our future episodes. All you have to do is to write a review in Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or whatever podcast platform you use. Send us that picture to our Twitter, @undecencypod, or to our email, undecencypod@gmail.com, with your question attached, and we will answer it in a future episode.
Now, for this episode in particular, we wanted to take the time out to walk our audience through a debate that has been raging in Brussels and across European capitals the past few weeks. And it's a debate that a lot of our listeners beyond Europe may find somewhat confusing at times, so we thought we would do a solo episode, no guest, just this week to unpack some of the complexity of this debate.
European strategic autonomy is goal number one for our generation. This is Charles Michel speaking, the President of the European Council, and he is talking about what is the big debate right now in Europe and in the United States, the idea of European strategic autonomy. Now, the idea is that the EU becomes a autonomous strategic actor in the world, a geopolitical player, not just a geopolitical playing field. Now, once you've said that, once you've given that basic definition, you've only just entered the intellectual battlefield. That is this debate about strategic autonomy, because it can mean radically different things to different people. Now, for example, for the Commission, autonomy is largely about green protectionism with a carbon levy on imports, for example. Some people have a more kind of expansionist understanding of strategic autonomy. For French President Emmanuel Macron, strategic autonomy or European sovereignty is a much bigger deal. He wants the EU to become a strong actor in a multipolar world, one that would be autonomous from the US and also from China, which means a more integrated EU, but also EU more capable of shaping the world. Now, this more integrated EU would be a stepping stone for having an EU which is capable of influencing world affairs. Macron's vision includes the vision of the Commission on some form of European protectionism, but it goes much further. He wants a form of common foreign policy, a common defense, and in many ways, this case for European sovereignty looks a lot like what you would see from French leaders, political leaders, 50, 40 years ago, such as de Gaulle, except now the appropriate level for sovereignty, for being able to weigh on the world, is the European sphere, not just the national sphere. So in many ways, the case for sovereignty is one that is familiar to the French. Now, the question is, can you have a European sovereignty without a European people or European demos? That is an open question. But the idea is the EU is now the critical level for having efficient sovereignty on the international sphere. Now, this case for autonomy was very strong when you had Donald Trump in the White House. Donald Trump would repeatedly threaten to leave NATO. He was rude, aggressive towards nearly all European leaders. And so to some extent, Biden's victory has taken away the momentum behind strategic autonomy now that you have a much more polite president. But Europeans on the back of their heads will now know that they're only 60, 100,000 votes away in Nevada and Pennsylvania from seeing Trump 2.0, maybe a Trump which is more coherent and better at implementing his agenda. Now, of course, this Euro-Gaullist argument is not a bestseller with everyone. You have a few people who deride it as, Macron's Napoleonic complex, wanting to build a Napoleonic Empire 2.0. And to be perfectly fair, even Charles de Gaulle saw the European community back in the days as France's attempt to reconstitute Napoleon's empire decades later. And it was Harold Macmillan who told de Gaulle that the European community looked a lot like Napoleon's empire. So I think deep down in France, there's the idea that the European Union can be a lever for French influence in the world. Now, Macron also has a lot of skin in this game because if you look back at his 2017 campaign, usually politicians in France don't talk much about the EU. They don't feel they've got much to gain on it. You had people criticizing it, but you rarely had people openly support. And Macron was pretty obvious in his support for the EU and wanting for a more integrated Europe. So essentially, his deal was he would offer to the French a Europeanization of France, make France more European, which meant modernizing the economy, reducing unemployment, reducing deficits. And once you've made France more European, you would then be able to make the case to make Europe more French, to make Europe a Euro-Gaullist political actor. So his attempts to make France more European started really well, but then you had the Gilets jaunes, and now you have COVID. But even before the Gilets jaunes and COVID, it started becoming apparent that not everyone in Europe were comfortable with this idea of, Euro-Gaullist idea of being strategically autonomous. Now, especially because you have, smaller states. A big thing about strategic autonomy is essentially a lot of the EU's competition anti-trust regulation has stopped mergers between French and German companies, for example. And in the EU, it wants to make sure there's a competitive economy. But the French and the Germans will argue that without these European champions, they're not able of shaping the international market, and they're being sidelined from international markets by stronger American and Chinese companies. So this might sound good to the French and Germans, but smaller European companies, smaller European countries with smaller companies may be less comfortable with the idea of allowing Franco-German economic giants to crush competition. So you have some pushbacks from these smaller states. And then obviously, if you want to have this debate about strategic autonomy, you need to talk with Germany. For a long time, Germany was uncomfortable with the idea of further European integration, which is the first step to being strategically autonomous in Macron's vision. Germany had largely reaped the benefits of its membership in the EU, but it also knew that further integration meant potential fiscal transfers to countries, and that was a major red line for German voters. And so in the past years, we saw how fragile the EU was, especially when there was a 5-star Lega government in Italy. And at this point, you have a kind of change in German policy, which is it was comfortable with not changing the EU, but all of a sudden they realized that the EU cannot stay midstream as it is. And so progressively, it got slightly more comfortable with some of the French and maybe Italian ideas of having more transfers, of being more integrated. And if you look at the summer, for example, when there was the negotiations for the EU Recovery Fund, Germany ended up siding with French into pressuring the Dutch to accept more generous terms for the heavily indebted countries in the south. While historically, if we go back to the negotiations with Greece in the 2010s, Germany would be much more closer to the frugal northern states. That said, on the issue of defense, you've seen some convergence between the German and the French. Both clearly want to bolster your defense, they want to spend more, and neither want to break ties with the United States and NATO. That case was true, whether it was Biden, whether it was Trump in the White House.
Well, I think I just wanted to maybe add a couple of things. I think you've drawn here a very comprehensive picture, and I think towards the end you were getting into one of the major stories, and I think it's just so important to highlight that. If you look at the recent developments, if you look at where the conversation has been around maybe in the past 10 to 15 years in EU integration, EU-wide debates, we are only now seeing this whole notion of strategic autonomy gain this central role, right? I mean, 10 years ago at EU Council meetings, at Commission, bureaucrats' offices, at the European Parliament, the debates would mostly be around the economy, the Eurozone, how to integrate economically, whether that be in terms of the single market or in terms of transfers, as you've discussed. And only now are we finally discussing the very important issues of defense, security, the strategic role that we should be playing on the world stage. And I think that's a very important point to highlight. And as you said, this new piece of the EU conversation is helping shape all of the other ones. I mean, as you said, the member state ambassadors in the EU are taking notes of where each other stand on these different issues, and that in turn informs where other debates will head. I mean, as you said, one example being that on a question such as the financial integration of the EU, right, the mutualization of debts, the extent to which the poorer member states can get to either borrow money at whether or not we're going to have like euro bonds, or whether these poorer member states are going to be able to get some form of solidarity from the richer ones. But as you said, on that question alone, Germany has traveled some way towards more of a Mediterranean position, right, where we've seen it side with Macron instead of with the Dutch and the Austrians, who are the kind of the frugals. So that would be just one observation. I think another one that you were also getting into that I think is so interesting is we really need to make absolutely clear that strategic and defense issues are only one aspect of strategic autonomy, or at least if we take Macron's definition of it. You were hinting at this earlier. I mean, a Europe that is more able to protect and defend itself through higher defense spending, through some form of cyber capabilities, the ability to deter cyber attacks, the ability as well to have a more active patrolling of the seas and waterways and whatnot. But that's only the defense and security aspect. As you explained, Macron's vision is larger. He also wants Europe to be strategically autonomous on the economic sphere. He wants Europe to be able to protect its, some of its industries. It wants it to act tougher on Chinese abuses, on trade and investment. It wants generally Europe to be a bigger economic player on the world stage. That's like another huge pillar of his vision. And then another point that I wanted to make, and I'll turn back to you with this, is that in fact, you and I were discussing, I believe last week, a piece of reporting that Politico came out with shortly after Macron gave his landmark interview to Le Grand Continent, which I think you were going to get into later and kind of walk us through what that was about. But shortly after that interview was a major. It was a bomb. I mean, it was widely shared, and it really shaped the conversation for the next few weeks. Then you had AKK come out with her own response that I believe she also ended up eventually publishing in Le Grand Continent. You were going to get into that as well. But the Politico piece reported this debate as being between what it called the strategic autonomy camp on one side and the Atlanticists on the other. And you and I were discussing what a funny way of looking at it that is. I mean, it's just not a framework that I would buy into. I think that framework essentially focuses on the ends of on the answers to the question of what role should the EU play on the world stage after all is said and done. Are we going to be a power that in a way is dependent on American defense patronage and on American strategic policies, right? Or are we going to be able to make our own policies and to act in an autonomous way? But there's a different way of looking at it, which is, I think the way that it's really playing out in European capitals is the main core debate that we're having now is, are we going to keep on track to hit the NATO defense targets? I mean, are we going to keep building up our defense capabilities so that we are actually putting our money where our mouths are and showing to the Americans that we actually care about the transatlantic relationship? And if you focus on that debate alone, the Germans are a tiny minority. Only AKK and the Germans are answering no to that question. Only they are saying that, listen, we can't really get these bills through Parliament. There's not a real clear case for us to be shifting troops around to the eastern flank. There's not such a clear case for. I mean, they've been the ones who've been beating around the bush and dragging their feet over the issue of defense spending. But the majority of European heads of state, the majority of European countries, and I would even submit that the majority of the European public holds a different view, which is that we should be investing more in defense. But within that, there's different objectives that you could be looking to fulfill with that higher defense spending. On one side, you have Macron, who's saying that we should be arming up and building up our capabilities, defense and economic wise, to be more autonomous. And on the other, you have, I would say, the Baltic countries, the Central European countries, the Eastern European countries, who are saying, yes, we need to beef up defense. Yes, we need to beef up strategically. But at the end of the day, our role in the world is never going to be distant and different from America's. We should always be looking at our role in the world through the transatlantic relationship and what we're able to achieve together. There's nothing that we are going to want to do strategically in an autonomous manner, and I think that's the real difference there between Macron, maybe and maybe other, as I said, like the Baltics or Poland or the Czech Republic. Say,
No, it's just to bounce back on what you said. I think the reason why strategic autonomy was never taken seriously in Europe, and now it is to a large extent, is that there was this kind of vision within European capitals in the EU that Europe was ahead in a kind of cycle of history, and cycle of history which would be dominated by trade and regulation and human rights. And if that's your vision, you don't really need to be strategically autonomous to that extent, because you're ahead of a curve, and strategic autonomous brings back to kind of old principles of hard power, which were a bit outdated to some extent. You know, the European was a vegetarian. It was in a world of carnivores, but it was a proud vegetarian in words of carnivores. It was thinking that all the other carnivores would become vegetarians in the near future. So that's why, to some extent, you've had this. And I think you've had, especially in Germany, there's been this kind of uncomfortable notion of strategic autonomy. If you look at what German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer says, yes, it seems like Macron and her have a major disagreement. They both agree to some extent that they should be having increased defense spending. They agree that there should be a stronger common EU defense. Nonetheless, the spat has made Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer very popular in Germany, and which is interesting, because historically, if there's one, German defense ministers are very unpopular, which is very strange for most countries, because usually the defense minister is a very popular guy, because he's in charge of the army, and the army tends to be pretty popular in countries. Germany, that's not the case. The defense minister, if you look, for example, at Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the commission, she used to be defense minister, and she was very unpopular. And this has made her pretty popular over the last few days, because you could argue that maybe this is AKK, who is making talking to a domestic audience and trying to become more popular and whatnot. But if those comments are popular, it says something about the German psyche around these issues. It says that the Germans are still uncomfortable with the idea that they could provide for, the Europeans could provide for their own defense. And when Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer attacks the anti-Americanism that goes around with some people who are pushing strategic autonomy, it's because of the German mindsets. You could see how strategic autonomy could echo some pretty distasteful historical political tendencies. So you can see the kind of ghost behind German strategic thinking. Now, you talk about other countries, not just Germany, and I think that's true. I think the other day we saw the Spanish defense minister say that he was closer to what Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer was saying than France.
If I can just interject, which was a huge victory for Germany to have a Mediterranean southern country. I wouldn't. I mean, I don't want to sell the guy too short. I don't really think that this debate is being widely enough covered in Spain for this to make much sense. What I believe it was Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez who said this, but it was a huge victory for Germany to have
Yes, it's Pedro Sanchez. Yes.
to have a Mediterranean country. And I remember someone in our network was tweeting, well, this is really bad news for Macron, because if he cannot get the Spaniards and the Italians and the Greeks on board with his vision as a Mediterranean nation, that France is, then Macron's in real trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. And I forgot. I think it was ECFR maybe, which wrote the other day, is Macron talking about strategic autonomy on his own. And this debate has evolved massively, as we've said in the past few minutes. And at least there's a debate about it that wouldn't have been 10, 15 years ago. But to a large extent, people are not comfortable with this idea yet. They agree that maybe we should have a stronger defense. Maybe we should have we should beef up our common European defenses. But to countries like Germany, what they understand as strategic autonomy is being comfortable with being complementary but remaining second fiddles to the Americans. I think the French vision is one day, progressively, a strategic autonomous Europe would be as mighty as the United States, and not simply complementary. And I think that's where the visions diverge. They agree right now that we should do more, but they don't agree what the landing zone will be, and that's a big issue because we've had this debate since the 1960s, when de Gaulle would want Europe to be European. The Germans made sure that they wouldn't steer away too far away from Americans. It's an old debate, and it says a lot of state about European politics.
And I really want to ask you, Francois, because you've been tracking this closely. You've been following what these ministers and prime ministers have been telling the media and etc., and how this whole debate is shaping up. And I wanted to ask you precisely where you think that AKK's position comes from and where Macron's position comes from. Before that, I wanted to do one quick. I want to make one quick observation. I thought it was so important right back at the start when you nuanced that when we talk about strategic autonomy, this isn't just a matter of what specific policy issue we're discussing. And of course, there's a difference between this strategic and defense bucket, right? That essentially means spending more on defense or spending more and smarter on defense, and having a smarter way of deploying troops that deters Russia. And on the other hand, we've got the economic sphere, right? And that means that can mean a set of different things, but largely being a strategic competitor to China and not kind of be accommodative of China as the Germans want to say,
and to the US as well. Don't forget all the
right, exactly,
on GAFAM and on the extrajudicial power of U.S. courts and so on.
Exactly. And in fact, that's precisely what I wanted to get into. But just to parse those two areas out, the strategic and defense on one hand, and the economics on the other. But you said another really important thing at the start, which is that it isn't just about policy areas; it's also about institutions. Because each of the EU institutions holds a different view of what strategic autonomy means. And as you said at the start, the European Commission, for instance, is very dug into this largely economic view of strategic autonomy. Obviously, the Commission handles antitrust, right? Antitrust at the European antitrust, as we should explain to our audience to give them enough background, has been mostly delegated, or at least in terms of the single market, the companies that operate across internal borders. The extent to which they're allowed to merge and to concentrate is regulated by the European Commission, which has a department. I forget what it's called, but it essentially handles antitrust. It was formerly held by Marguerite Vestager, who was like the horror of the GAFAs and the big American multinationals, because she was really tough. But as you said at the start, I thought it was so important to nuance that. If you ask Commission officials, they would mostly emphasize green protectionism, green taxes. So the idea, for instance, and I think this was actually a provision that was pegged onto the budget deal that we're now discussing, that is now being held up by Hungary and Poland, but it was added with everyone's support, I believe. The idea of creating what the Commission calls our own resources, and it's so important. This notion of own resources, which is a financial notion, is the idea that the EU can levy its own taxes. Because let's remind our audience, the EU does not levy taxes; it essentially just has money transferred from national treasuries until the day when it will. I think it already levies a couple of taxes on like plastic waste and whatnot. But the EU budget deal that is in the works right now will substantially beef that up, and there will be more taxes that the EU will be able to levy. And there's also obviously the proposal for a carbon adjustment tax, which is the idea that in the EU we already have a carbon mechanism. So the idea that the Commission distributes emission permits to European companies, and then they get to trade those off, and that's just a mechanism to gradually, year on year, reduce overall emissions by having the market essentially allocate where these emissions are most efficiently, allocated. But now, increasingly, there's also the idea, and this really goes to what you were explaining at the start, Francois, the idea of green protectionism. That's exactly what it is the idea that we, the Europeans, are taking up a lot of the burden for reducing emissions, but it isn't fair if we're having these other great powers like China and the United States that are not as serious about reducing emissions sell their products into our market, which have been produced at a lower cost because obviously the environmental regulations are lower, but they're able to sell these products which cost less. So that's an unfair competition. So the proposal now that I forget at what stage of the negotiations this is on, but I don't think it's in the budget. Now they want to have a carbon border adjustment tax. I think it's the long, which is essentially that you get to charge a tariff on products that come into the European market on the basis of how much carbon has been emitted in producing them. And that is a clear it's a clear example of what at the start you called green protectionism, and that's the view of the European Commission. But then different, as you said, different institutions in different countries will have different views. But I really wanted to ask you this about both AKK and Macron, because you explained at the start, AKK, right? She's carved out this reputation for herself, which is a heck of an achievement when you're a defense minister in a country like Germany. Because in a country like, let's not remember, Germany is one of the most defense averse countries in Europe. The Bundestag, essentially, one of the I would want. I'm pretty hawkish, but even I would want to cut some slack to the Germans, to the German politicians, because it's very hard for them to pass a budget that has increased defense spending. Because obviously the Greens are a huge party in Germany. Even the SPD is very kind of pacifist and whatnot. So it's very hard for them to pass a budget that increases defense spending. So that's where the problem kind of starts. And my question to you is, we've got AKK, who has come out in public having this very Atlanticist, as she calls it. I would disagree with that characterization, but she calls it Atlanticism, the idea that we shouldn't be autonomous, that our strategic role is embedded within the transatlantic relationship, and our goals are America's goals, essentially. So my question is, where does that come from? Do you think that AKK is essentially thinking, well, we're never going to be able to shove through higher defense spending to shove it down the throats of the German public, and so this whole debate of strategic autonomy is going to cost us in the long term, because Macron is essentially playing the German public against the German government and making the German government more unpopular, because now they have to.
He's doing something even tactically smarter, which is in his interview with Grand Continent, he says, I disagree with what AKK has said, but according to what I have understood, the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, is not on her line. He's putting pressure on Merkel to go in his, approve his vision and disapprove hers.
That's so enfant terrible. That's fantastic. I love that he's messing around with the German cabinet. But didn't he? Let's have you explain to our audience, because I think that a few days before he said that, he had also cut a lot of flack, Macron, for calling AKK naive or something along those lines, and that got picked up by Der Spiegel or one of the major papers, and then that whole spat kind of grew out of that. But just to go back to my question, is why do you think that AKK specifically has picked up this crusade, acting as a sort of the voice against strategic autonomy? And then on the other hand, is what about Macron? Do you think that he is this like a larger ball game that he's playing where he wants to like isolate Germany and maybe get some support from
No,
other?
no, no. So, so on the AKK question, first of all, she was very unpopular a few months ago, so this was a good way to put herself on the map again, and she's become very popular. And all of a sudden, people were starting to think she could become leader of the CDU again.
Oh, okay.
That might be a long shot, but I have to caveat the disagreement because both AKK and Macron share the idea that there should be more defense spending and there should be a stronger common EU defense policy. They just don't really agree what they would do with that stronger defense and that stronger. So, again, as I've said, Macron wants strategic autonomy to end up, to be a form of European sovereignty, properly speaking of, and AKK is comfortable with the idea that strategic autonomy simply means being complementary with the United States. So there's this disagreement. On Macron's side, I think there was a piece the other day in Politico calling Macron the think tanker in chief.
Yes, that was Rim Mortaz, wasn't she?
Yeah,
And
I thought that was very funny.
yeah, that's. I'd love for you to walk us through, and you've already said a lot about kind of the tradition, the Gaullist tradition of French statesmen banging on about sovereignty, and now we've got that being transferred from the French to the European stage. But yeah, tell us more about like what is Macron thinking? What's the longer game here?
Well, I think a bit of the idea behind the political piece was that Macron kind of bounces ideas around, like a think tanker. And we had Benjamin Haddad with us, and a few I think it was last year, he wrote something called Macron Strategy Disruption, and he likes changing things, and he has an idea of what Europe should be, and sometimes saying what Europe should be can end up making your job much more complicated because there's a principle of reality as well, which is, well, maybe in an ideal world, Europe should be this way and this way and this way, but you have to make do with the realities on the ground. So I'm not exactly sure because it seems to me like this strategy is antagonistic. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and it's a bit rash to some extent. So it's a bit of a Macron style of saying that the old system is ossified and needs a shake-up. But actually saying it needs a shake-up might make that shake-up more complicated. So I don't know exactly. He might be very genuine. Disruption might help him. If he thinks he's going to do a second term, he could put these ideas on a map for the future. Saying he was a visionary and had these ideas a long time ago and whatnot. So I'm not sure exactly, but I'm very happy with having this conversation. I think intellectually it's fascinating, but I'm not sure if it's the president who should be starting these conversations in the first place. So it's a bit of an odd situation. He's a think tank and a president.
Yeah, and let's kind of walk through some of the rationales. What the rationales could be for Macron wanting to play the think tanker president's role, right? I mean, obviously, as I think you've explained a couple of times on the show, Macron is a heck of a special character, right? He's obviously a lot of his career has been defined by just sheer ambition, and he's obviously a man full of ideas and he wants to affect a lot. I mean, he's already affected so much change on the French political sphere alone by realigning politics. And he had a really interesting piece in the National Interest earlier last week, and maybe we can get into it. But he's a man of he talks a big game about reshuffling stuff and change, right? Now, my one supposition you could make is that maybe he's trying to, in a way, upset. If you were really cynical, maybe you would maybe think that Macron is trying to upset the balance of power in EU Council, at the EU Council and at the EU level, He wants, in a way, to kind of make Germany seem stingy. Look at these Germans and look at AKK, who are essentially on the side of fecklessness, right? Their case is essentially that we shouldn't be spending money because what are we going to do with a higher defense budget if, at the end of the day, where we should be relying on the Americans? And that it's kind of a hard case to make in a world that is becoming more unsafe by the day. And maybe that there's a longer strategic game there where Macron is trying to beef up France's role in Europe by getting people to rally around his vision. And that includes, obviously, people within Mediterranean countries. And obviously, the Pedro Sanchez comment was a big setback for Macron. But maybe he's got a longer game going where he wants to isolate Germany on this debate. That would be one rationale. And then the other rationale, and I think you can be very useful to our audience by walking us through the idea of this economic war with the United States and what it's looked like in terms of companies that have been subjected to extraterritorial judicial authority by the U.S. Department of Justice and whatnot. And maybe you can walk us through some of those cases. But another aspect of this could be, economic autonomy, and not only in terms of antitrust, which is a huge case. And as we said, that's one of the areas where we already have a lot of strategic autonomy. The European Commission has de facto huge power over American tech companies. It has made them cough up billions of dollars in fines. We saw that with Google in, I believe, Ireland. Google had a major court case in Ireland, but also with Facebook and some of the social media platforms have had cases with the Commission. So maybe you have a case there about the EU is essentially an association of states. It doesn't have a lot of financial resources because it has a budget that is peanuts, really. It's like 1% of the EU's GDP. States are very stingy in how much money they want to give to the EU. But the EU should leverage the internal market, the sheer power of the internal market, to wield power in terms of, and we've discussed this. Remember the Brussels effect. Anu Bradford, who was a legal scholar at Columbia, she's a Finnish-American lawyer. She came out with this book earlier last summer called The Brussels Effect. And what she means by that is essentially the regulatory power of the European Union. So the idea that even though the EU is not a strong state because it doesn't have a large budget, it relies on a huge single market. And the ability of the European Commission as a legal entity to penalize companies when they don't abide by the rules of our enormous market is huge. There's a huge power there, and we've seen it with big tech.
And green protectionism as well, because if all of a sudden you need to lower your carbon emissions to enter the EU market without being sanctioned by too high a tariff, and it changes behaviors.
Exactly. And one last aspect that I could hypothesize Macron also has in mind is the idea that he also wants to play a huge role on this sort of the diplomatic scene worldwide. We've seen him. He was, before him it was François Hollande, but the French president has played a huge role, both him and François Hollande, in brokering the Iran agreement. Right, the French have always been very in favor of talking to the Iranians, talking them into reducing their nuclear capabilities. And then also on the climate deal, the Paris Accord was a huge victory for France on the world stage. It was signed in Paris. It was a huge reputational boost for France, and France was also very involved in getting all of these countries together to agree on an albeit meager agreement. So among those several few things, maybe you can think of more, but which ones do you think weigh more heavily in Macron's mind? He essentially cares about all of them, of course, but where do you think he stands?
Well, I think you can't exclude there's also domestic reasons. First of all, as I've said, his contract to the French people in 2017 is, if you vote for me, I'll make France more European, but then I'll make Europe more French. And he needs to at least give the impression he is pushing that. So that's a strong aspect of it. And I think the French also like the idea of having a French president that is a important international actor. If you look in the polls, usually one of the aspects on which Macron is strongest is on the idea that he represents France internationally well. In every poll, people agree that at least internationally, he gives a good image of France. whether they agree with his domestic policies or not. So when he ends up in Lebanon, when he ends up talking this big swashbuckling agenda, it makes the French people proud, and the French people want a president who's able of talking to the world. It's for a self-image and understanding who they are. I think it's important. So there's this aspect which can't be excluded. And again, I think we go back to the idea that to French thinkers, the EU could be a lever for French influence. So that's what he's pushing. He wants to shake things up and make people realize that the EU could be the springboard for larger ambitions, not just for France but for other countries. So I think that's what. But maybe the strategy is wrong. Maybe the tactics to get to that kind of broader strategy are wrong. Maybe he's antagonizing too many people, not. So you can't fully exclude that. But again, just like we said, AKK might have a few domestic reasons to exaggerate her conflict with Macron. I think Macron also has some reasons to exaggerate it. He wants to show to the French he's shaking things up, and he's trying to make Europe more French.
And I wanted to ask you, François, specifically about one issue that we've left out of the wheelhouse here, which is China. Because I wanted to ask you about how the issue of China has played out in France post-COVID, how it was playing out before COVID, and specifically how you can compare it with Germany. I mean, you may remember back a few weeks ago when we had John Kampfner, we discussed at length how Germany has traditionally had a very accommodative role towards China since reunification. Never been very much of tough talk against China from the Germans, much of which was due, as Kampfner explained, to corporate capture of foreign policy. Essentially, you had the huge business lobby in Germany that, although they have they are now increasingly waking up to the Chinese threat. There was that report that you quoted where they labeled China as a strategic threat, but traditionally, German corporate interests, the big car making companies, the big German multinationals who still see China as a huge market and a market full of opportunities, are perhaps among the friendliest to the Chinese government. They don't want a tough policy on China because they want to keep access to the Chinese market. And this week we had Xi Jinping, who was very aware of these dynamics. He's probably the smartest man in China, but he's been playing. He wants to play out. I think Politico was reporting along these lines. Xi Jinping has been trying to play out the Europeans against one another. He's called up Merkel, saying, listen, it's not in Europe's interest to go down the road of a strategic conflict, a Europe-China strategic conflict, because we have so much in common. We have these mutual interests. You sell so much of your stuff to our people, and vice versa, and we provide a lot of stuff to you. We've been very helpful with COVID relief, etc. But those were kind of some of the headlines of the conversation. And right there, Xi Jinping was trying to appease Germany and get them to kind of stay in line and not act too tough. But I wonder, and we also saw the role of German diplomats, EU diplomats of German nationality, in appeasing a disinformation report that was going to come out a few months ago about COVID, etc. People can go back to our episode with John Kampfner if they're interested in it. It's a fascinating conversation. But I wanted to ask you how China has been playing out in France. Is there any appetite for greater toughness against China on the part of Macron, on the part of his party, on the part of the French public as a whole?
Right. So I think the debate on China has been less important than in Germany and the UK, and especially the United States. Now, that said, the idea that we should be sovereign is an idea that rings to the French a lot more maybe than in Germany. And very early on, France decided to create regulatory hurdles to make sure that Huawei, for example, wouldn't be setting up a 5G network in France. So quite early on, there was a realization that letting Huawei build, part of a 5G network, was a risk to the sovereignty of France. But it wasn't that big of a conversation because there's always been this idea that the French state should be able to protect its economic sovereignty. So it wasn't squarely about China in that sense. That said, there's a realization of China's record on human rights, its behavior on intellectual property, and so on. So there's no naivete in France about these issues. It just hasn't been as much of an existential issue as it has been in the United States, for example, or even in the UK and Germany, where the Huawei debate was very important. Because when France talks about strategic autonomy, yes, of course, it thinks about China, which is kind of obvious, but it is also concerned about the United States. And as I said, the past few years, we saw some pretty hefty fines on French company, on Société Générale, and whatnot, because of very how could I say, the extrajudicial and extraterritorial nature of U.S. law. For example, whenever French company uses dollars, or whenever a French company has a Gmail account, they are liable to American law. So that has some pretty massive consequences. So when we talk about strategic autonomy, yes, we have China in mind, but we are focused a little more about the United States than we are on China because the French have a bit of a tradition, of course, with America and American influence in France. But just one thing: this is not to say, obviously, that America's behavior is more extreme than Chinese behavior. It's just that other countries will never talk about America's extrajudicial, extraterritorial laws, and they'll focus mainly on China, while France will end up focusing on both.
Yeah, and that's also interesting because it kind of it also points towards another issue where this plays out, which is in the defense space. Macron himself and France generally has been very warm to greater European defense cooperation. So not only member states spending more on their national defense and their national armies, which can then get redeployed through NATO, but also spending on defense cooperation mechanisms that the EU has set up, mostly the EDF, the European Defense Fund, and PESCO. And the Americans hate that. The Americans hate that because they see that as a European protectionism. So they would much rather have European nation states individually contract with American military contractors to buy all these, state of the art military equipment and whatnot, rather than spend money among themselves in a way that, due to European Commission rules and whatnot, is always going to benefit European companies more so than American companies. But it's interesting there, and maybe another day we should dedicate a whole episode to what you just described there in terms of what the French call the economic war between France and the United States. But it would be an interesting topic to touch on because people oftentimes would underestimate the extent to which, for one thing, American law has this extra territorial breadth of application, and the specific cases in recent history where that has hurt certain French companies, and why that has bred a certain skepticism towards America. But anyway, I think we've covered so much ground, and I'm so happy we were able to do this episode because this whole debate. Let's just be very clear. I mean, right at the very start, you hinted that the reason that we're having this conversation is because of Donald Trump and his rhetoric around, you Europeans should pay up, you should stop free riding on America, and you should stop expecting America to help you with your foreign policy goals, such as reducing climate emissions, helping Iran get away with nuclear weapons or whatever. But one of the things we should make very clear is that regardless of who sits on the White House, this is a debate that's not going to go away. You're always going to have people like Macron who, regardless, even if we have a Democrat in the White House, who's probably going to take some of the foot off the pedal on defense issues and probably be less confrontational with Europe. You're always going to have leaders like Macron who say, listen, folks, this can no longer go on as usual, and we need to take our own security in our own hands. So we're going to keep hearing about this debate, and I was so happy that we were able to give our audience maybe just a basic kind of rundown of where the arguments lie and what the situation is. and in terms of the ACACA, Macron spat, etc. But for now, let us thank our audience again once more for tuning in, for bearing with us, and we hope to have you on another episode. Thank you so much.
Also, don't forget to send us your questions. All you have to do is to write a review in Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or whatever podcast platform you use. Send us that picture to our Twitter @undecencypod or to our email undecencypod@gmail with your question attached, and we will answer it in a future episode.
Keep the reviews coming, and see you next week.
See you next week.